All right, let's dive into Ulster. We've got a whole bunch of articles and history books here ready to uncover the mysteries of this place. It's going to be a real crash course, folks, so buckle up. We're talking ancient legends, turbulent history, and a culture that's, well, let's just say it's as fascinating as it is complex.
Yeah, it's definitely more than just a dot on the map. What we call Ulster today, it's actually one of Ireland's four provinces. See,
Hmm.
second largest, second most populous. 9 counties total, but here's the catch. 6 of those counties, they're in Northern Ireland, part of the UK, and the other 3, part of the Republic of Ireland. So right off the bat, we're dealing with a divided land.
Divided land, you said it. And it sounds like that the division goes way back. But before we get into all that, the plantations and the partitions and all that, I'm really curious about the name itself, Ulster. Where does it even come from?
Oh, the name has a story, all right. It comes from those ancient Gaelic tribes, the Ulad. Their territory, in Irish Gaelic, it was Cuaig Ulad, basically fifth of the Ulad. Even back then, it was like its own distinct fifth of something bigger. Then the Norsemen came along, they had a big impact on Ireland, and added their own twist, called it Ulastir. So you got the Ulad name combined with Tyr, which is Norse for land, and over time, that morphed into Ulster.
So it's a name that's got all these layers, different cultures all mixed in, and those ancient roots, they're all over those legendary stories, right? The Ulster cycle. Epic heroes, battles, mythical creatures, the whole shebang.
Ah, the Ulster cycle. Yeah, it's full of them. The most famous one, that's Tain Bo Cuailnge, the cattle raid of Cooley, is basically a war, full-on war between Ulster and Connacht, all over a prize bull. The lengths these warriors went to, you wouldn't believe it.
Uh-huh. A little more dramatic than a trip to the auction house, eh? But those stories, they're not just entertaining. They give you a glimpse into those ancient Ulad, their warrior culture, what they valued, how they felt about this land.
Exactly. And it's not just stories. The land itself, it's got proof of that ancient past. Yeah. Like the Giant's Ring. It's near Belfast. Huge earthwork. Massive dolmen right in the center. Things over 5,000 years old. Tells you there was a whole society there, prehistoric, with rituals and beliefs and all that.
5,000 years. Wow. That really puts things in perspective, doesn't it? But I'm guessing ancient Ulster wasn't all peaceful storytelling and rituals. There had to be power struggles, conflicts, right?
Oh, absolutely. Remember that fifth of the Ulud thing? Well, you had
Okay.
other over-kingdoms in Ireland. Each one wanted to be top dog,
Yeah.
and they clashed big time. The Battle of Moira back in 637 AD, that wasn't just a little local squabble. It was a massive battle, the kind that reshapes the whole political landscape.
Yeah.
Shifting alliances, betrayals, a fight for dominance, all happening right there on Ulster soil.
So we've got ancient tribes, epic tales, power struggles that, well, kind of foreshadow what's coming later, don't they? But then things change big time, right? The plantation. That wasn't just folks moving in, was it?
Not at all. The plantation of Ulster, that was the 17th century, it was deliberate, organized. King James I, he was the one behind it, saw Ulster as, well, ripe for the taking, time to reshape it his way.
And that reshaping involved more than just, encouraging folks to move there. It was taking land, kicking the native Irish off their land, and bringing in, well, a whole bunch of Protestant settlers, most of them from Scotland. Sounds like a recipe for trouble, to say the least.
It definitely was. The goal, officially, was to civilize the place. They saw it as barbarous, you see. Sir John Davies, he was the Attorney General for Ireland back then, put it pretty bluntly, said a barbarous country must first be broken by war before it will be capable of good government.
Yikes. That's pretty chilling. Really tells you something about how they saw the whole thing, the power dynamics at play. But it wasn't just about, imposing a culture. It was about economics, too, wasn't it? Ulster had valuable resources, right?
You're spot on. Control the land, control the resources, it all goes hand in hand. And Ulster had plenty to offer. Fertile land, access to waterways, potential for development. It wasn't just about a new culture. It was about power, economic and political.
So it's multi-layered, this whole thing. Culture, religion, economics, all tangled up. And the consequences of this breaking of Ulster, they were pretty huge, right?
They were. It changed the whole makeup of the province, created a division that would last. Native Irish, mostly Catholic, and the Protestant settlers. The seeds of sectarianism, conflict, they were sown right there, and they would plague Ulster for generations to come.
It's kind of ironic, isn't it? Trying to impose order, and it just ends up fueling resentment. And it didn't just affect those 6 counties that would eventually become Northern Ireland, right?
Right, you are. The plantation, it was officially focused on certain areas, but the impact, it was much wider. It added another layer of complexity to a place that was already pretty complex to begin with.
So we've gone from ancient legends to plantations. Sounds like things are about to get a whole lot more turbulent. What happens next in this saga?
Well, remember those tensions we talked about?
Mm.
They're about to boil over. Rebellions, wars. Ulster's about to go through the fire. And that's where we'll pick up next time in our next deep dive. Ulster in the 17th century, it was, well, kind of like a powder keg just waiting to blow. You had all that resentment, all that tension from the plantation, just simmering beneath the surface.
And blow it did. The Irish Rebellion of 1641. That wasn't just a little protest, was it? It was a full-on rebellion, a direct response to all those injustices, all that anger the plantation had caused.
Think about it, being forced off your land, your home, your whole way of life disrupted, your future. Who knows what'll happen? The rebellion, Sir Phelim O'Neill, he was the one who spearheaded it. It was all that frustration, all that anger boiling over. It started as, a political thing, but it turned violent, fast. Attacks on the colonists, it got ugly.
It really shows you how deep those wounds went, doesn't it? The plantation, I mean. It wasn't just land, it was everything. Identity, culture, belonging. It was all ripped away.
Exactly. And that cycle of violence, once it starts, it's hard to stop. Thousands of colonists died, and the fighting, it spread like wildfire. Pretty soon, most of Ulster, most of Ireland, it was engulfed in bloodshed. Revenge and more revenge.
A dark chapter, for sure. But there were moments of resistance, too, weren't there? The Battle of Benburb back in '46. Owen Roe O'Neill, he led the Irish forces to a pretty stunning victory there, didn't he?
O'Neill, he was something else. Fought in the Spanish army, brought all that military know-how back with him to Ireland. Benburb, he was brilliant, outsmarted his opponents, the Scottish Covenanters, total defeat for them, a major victory for the Irish. O'Neill, he was a tactical genius, there's no doubt about it.
Victories like that, they were important, but they couldn't hold back the tide forever. The Cromwellian conquest, the 1650s. Cromwell himself came over, and well, it was brutal, devastating, a real turning point for Ireland. And Ulster, it was right in the path of Cromwell's wrath.
Cromwell, he was ruthless, absolutely determined to crush any resistance. Brutality, massacres, land confiscations, the whole 9 yards. The native Irish population was decimated, their land gone. It was systematic. Break their spirit, make sure England was in control. That was the goal.
And just when you think it can't get any worse, a few decades later, bam, another conflict, the Williamite War, late 17th century. Ulster just couldn't catch a break, could it?
The Williamite War, that wasn't just an Irish thing. It was part of a bigger European power struggle. William of Orange, Protestant, against King James II, who was Catholic. And those religious and political divisions, they played out big time in Ulster.
So once again, Ulster's a battleground for forces outside its borders. But for the people living there, it wasn't just about some king on a throne, was it? It was personal. Freedom, religion, where they belonged, all of that.
You got it. The Siege of Derry, that became a symbol. Protestant defiance.
Yeah.
The city, they held out against the Jacobite siege for over 100 days. And then, of course, you got the Battle of the Boyne. Most famous battle in Irish history, probably. William's forces crushed James.
Those battles, the Boyne especially, they're still a big deal today, aren't they? The Orange Order, they still commemorate them, parades, marches, the whole thing. Still causes tension all these centuries later. Shows you how deep those historical events go.
It does. It shows you the power of history.
Yeah.
How it shapes people, their identities, how they see the world, even today. But in the middle of all this conflict, there's another story happening. People migrating, looking for a new start.
Right, the Ulster Scots heading to North America. That was the 18th century, wasn't it? It's a big part of the story, shows how all this turmoil in Ulster had ripple effects, It wasn't just individuals looking for a better life, it was a mass exodus. Hardship, persecution, the need for land, opportunity, all of that pushing them out.
Think about this. Between 1717 and 1770, over 160,000 of them crossed the Atlantic. Men, women, children. They wanted to escape poverty, find religious freedom, make a new life for themselves. Most ended up in the American colonies. That's where they became the Scots-Irish, or Scotch-Irish, depending on who you ask.
It's amazing to think about all those people leaving Ulster, their descendants all over the U.S. now. It really shows you how migration changes things, both where people come from and where they go. But they weren't exactly welcomed with open arms on the East Coast, were they?
No, not really. The folks already living there on the East Coast, they were a bit suspicious of these newcomers. Thought they were rough, independent, a little too fond of their guns. But the Ulster Scots, they were resilient, determined. They kept moving, pushing inland into the Appalachian Mountains, the Ohio Valley, became pioneers on the American frontier.
So they helped shape America, especially in those frontier areas. I've heard their influence is still there in the music, the stories, even the way people talk in Appalachia.
It's true. They brought their traditions, their music, their stories, and that fierce independence, never lost that. Jim Webb, he's a writer. He wrote a book called Born Fighting, and he argues that a lot of what we think of as the American spirit, loyalty to family, not trusting authority, liking your guns, that all comes from Scots-Irish.
It's a fascinating idea, isn't it? The Ulster Scots, they're a reminder that history, it's not just about one place. It's about connections, how things move and change across time and continents.
Absolutely. Ulster's story, it's connected to so many others, especially America's. But back in Ulster, things were changing too. Industry was booming, Belfast was becoming a major center, and all those old tensions between Unionists and Nationalists, they were coming back with a vengeance.
We've come a long way, haven't we? From those ancient legends of Ulster to the plantation, the rebellions, even following the Ulster Scots all the way to America. And now, here we are in the 19th century. Things are changing fast, not just in Ulster, but in all of Ireland. It's a time of progress, but also, like you said, those old divisions are coming back with a vengeance.
It's a time of contradictions, that's for sure. On the one hand, you've got this incredible economic boom happening in Ulster. Industry's taking off, and the place is becoming a real powerhouse. But then on the other hand, you've got the Unionists and the Nationalists, mainly divided by religion, and they're clashing more and more. It's all going to culminate in the partition of Ireland.
It's like two different stories happening at the same time. You've got Belfast becoming this major industrial center, shipbuilding, linen production, all these signs of progress and modernity. It's hard to imagine that Belfast was actually bigger than Dublin at one point, the biggest city in all of Ireland.
It shows you how unique Ulster was, its position in Ireland. It became a hub of activity, driving modernization on the island. Those shipyards in Belfast where they built ships like the Titanic, they were symbols of Ulster's industrial might.
But even with all that progress, those old tensions were still there, bubbling under the surface. The whole debate about home rule, giving Ireland more control over its own affairs while still being part of the UK, that really brought the divide between Unionists, mostly Protestant, and Nationalists, mostly Catholic, back to the forefront. What exactly did home rule mean, and why was it so controversial?
Home rule, well, it was a complicated issue. It had been brewing for decades. It was basically a proposal to give Ireland some autonomy within the UK. They could handle their own internal matters, but they'd still be part of the British Empire. Nationalists saw it as a step towards full independence, but for Unionists, especially in Ulster, it felt like a threat. They were worried about being pushed aside in a self-governing Ireland that would have a Catholic majority.
So it wasn't just politics, it was about deep-seated fears, old resentments coming back to the surface. And that fear, it wasn't just talk, it led to action, like the Ulster Covenant in 1912.
The Ulster Covenant was a strong message against home rule. Hundreds of thousands of Unionists signed it, saying they would resist any attempt to break away from Britain. They were serious about keeping the Union, even if it meant fighting for it. That's when they formed the Ulster Volunteer Force, which was like a paramilitary group, ready to take action if they had to.
Sounds like things were getting pretty heated. Then World War I started in 1914. I guess that must have shifted the focus for a while, took some of the heat off those internal tensions.
It did, to some extent. Irishmen from all sides, Unionists and Nationalists, they joined the war effort. But the war also had a big impact on Irish nationalism. It made people want full independence even more. And then came the Easter Rising in 1916. It was a rebellion against British rule, and even though it didn't succeed, it became this really important symbol in the fight for Irish independence.
And those events, they set the stage for what would become a huge turning point, the partition of Ireland in 1921. How did that happen?
Well, after the Easter Rising came the Irish War of Independence, and that war made the divisions in Ulster even worse. There was terrible violence, especially in Belfast. Sectarian clashes, hundreds of people died. It became clear that something had to be done to stop the violence, even if the solution wasn't perfect.
And that solution was partition, splitting Ireland into two separate entities.
Exactly. In 1921, the Government of Ireland Act was passed, and that officially partitioned the island. 6 counties in Ulster, the ones with a Protestant majority, they stayed part of the UK as Northern Ireland. And the other 26 counties, they became independent as the Irish Free State, which later became the Republic of Ireland. It was a compromise, a way to try to stop the fighting, but it left a lot of unresolved issues. And those issues would come back to haunt Ireland later on.
It sounds like partitions stopped the bloodshed for a while, but didn't really solve the root problems. And those problems came back with a vengeance, didn't they? The Troubles, that period of conflict that lasted for decades.
The Troubles were a terrible time, a complex and tragic chapter in Ulster's story. Those unresolved issues about identity, about belonging, about historical wrongs, they all came to the surface. There was so much violence, fear, and division. The Good Friday Agreement in 1998 finally brought an end to the worst of the fighting, but the scars are still there.
So, looking back at everything we've learned, from those ancient legends to the plantations, the rebellions, the emigration, the Industrial Revolution, and the partition, what does it all tell us about Ulster? What can we take away from this journey through its past?
Ulster's story is a mix of so many things: legend, resilience, conflict, and a longing for peace. It reminds us that history isn't just something in the past, it shapes who we are, our communities, even the world we live in.
It's true, the past is never really gone. It stays with us. It makes you think, doesn't it? How do you think all of this history, the myths, the plantations, the partitions, how have they shaped the people of Ulster, both in Northern Ireland and the Republic? What do you think?
That's a great question, and it's not an easy one to answer. But as you keep learning about Ulster's past, those parts that really interest you, remember that history is an ongoing conversation. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, keep peeling back the layers of this fascinating and complex place.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Ulster. Until next time, stay curious.